Hello, I'm Stephanie Baloris, your host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, I'm joined by Vice President and Principal Analyst Liz Herber to discuss the impact of generative AI on ERP systems. Welcome, Liz.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Stephanie.
So let's get into it. AI isn't new to ERP, is it? And maybe you can even give some historical examples about how it's been in ERP all along.
Yeah, so the interesting thing with the evolution of ERP is that we first started hearing a lot of discussion about AI in around 2016. That was really the first wave. Oracle, who's one of the larger players in the ERP space, started talking about adaptive intelligent apps and machine learning. SAP started talking about the intelligent enterprise. But in reality, a lot of AI, just the idea that the solution could adapt over time based on machine learning and other inputs, has been slowly and steadily evolving. Even things like the ability to interface with it through natural language processing or through, things that today we might take for granted has really been a slow evolution. And so really what we see now is more of an inflection point where we're hitting this fast pace of disruption. And of course, generative AI is chief in charge of what is going on there.
Right. Let's actually talk about generative AI capabilities, because as you mentioned, it's not like there hasn't been machine learning algorithms and general AI capabilities built into these systems for a long time. But generative AI seems to be, like you mentioned, the inflection point where it's like, okay, now what are you really doing that's different? So what is different now? Like, what are ERP vendors developing?
So a lot of what they are doing today is very early stage examples of generative AI. We've seen a lot of focus on things like summarization. So for example, in ERP, one of the big tasks of finance is to close the books and report on the financials externally, whether that's to shareholders or the board or just managers. So one early use case is simply narrative reporting. Rather than a person go through all of the financial data and talk about where the business is performing well and where it isn't, that's an easy task for generative AI to sift through all of those documents. But we are also seeing the emergence of some more innovative cases. And where I think a lot of the disruption will start to take place is much more around mining all of that great information that all of our companies hold and being able to advise and predict on next actions to take. So going beyond just sort of the, automation of tasks we're doing today, but into areas where you're fundamentally changing what the business is able to do.
So that's a lot more interesting. And in general, do you feel that the roles within a company who typically use ERP, because we are talking about the finance and accounting, we're talking about procurement, we are talking about line of business owners. Are they open to it, or actually potentially are they even more open to Gen AI than other roles?
I'd say it's a big mix. Like you say, ERP touches so many different roles in a company, but a lot of them are more conservative roles. I mean, in finance, which is one core population that uses ERP, there's very low tolerance for mistakes. You don't want to report in the wrong currency and think you have a profit where you don't. You don't want to, state that your company is performing well when it's not. And the stakes are high. CFOs can go to jail if things are inaccurately reported, especially if you're in a public company. But really in all companies, this isn't really a place where errors are tolerated. So in a lot of ways, that does make it ripe for AI because AI can make things more accurate. But at the same time, as we're in this learning curve and we've all experienced how inaccurate AI can be, it does give a lot of people pause. The other dynamic that you see is oftentimes ERP buyers are just more conservative generally, and they haven't necessarily modernized systems. So that's going to hold them back. Even if they'd like to use AI, even if they're open-minded to it, there's still a lot of modernization that has to happen. And a lot of that has to do with, especially in industries like manufacturing, where people have been more conservative to move this system to the cloud or haven't necessarily seen the obvious benefits of taking a risk like that. So that's going to be another hurdle, even if their mentality is very open-minded and positive towards AI.
Right. So yeah, in order to take advantage of some of these new capabilities, it means you'll have to be on the latest version of the system, which means in the cloud. Plus, you also have all the integrations with on-prem systems, legacy systems that haven't necessarily updated either.
Exactly. And ERP often is a rat's nest of systems. I mean, one of the clients we're working with right now, they've got hundreds of systems. Some of them are, 20 to 30 years old. And this comprises this ERP suite that they've cobbled together. So, even if they start to modernize pieces of it, you very well could be living in this world where some of the pieces are still very old, because that takes a long time and a lot of money to really get up to speed. ERP is complex, it's hefty. And for a lot of organizations, modernizing it will take multiple years.
And your report specifically about Gen AI in ERP, let's get back to some of the use cases. And you've already touched on a few of them, but what are the ones that seem the most promising or people are talking about next?
In the early days, we see a lot of the text creation being the most valuable, or chart creation. You're not necessarily dealing with creative graphics and imagery in ERP. You're more dealing with reporting on facts and numbers and business performance. So a lot of the early examples will be around text creation and summarization. One example that's starting to emerge related to text creation is the idea of what's called dunning, and that's writing collections emails to your customers. For a lot of businesses, there's a difference between what they sold and contracted for and the actual money they took in. So the collections process is an important one. That's a place where you can easily see how text creation could help simplify and automate writing those kinds of emails and adjusting for specific characteristics of those customers, and really eliminating task from people whose time could be used for much more strategic work versus just writing these collections emails or going out and doing collections. We also see longer term the rise of co-pilots. I'll be the first to say that's very early right now. You do hear vendors talking about it in their conferences, but when you really look at how mature that is, it's extremely early days. But if you think about, any kind of operational role in a company, asking how's the business performing? How would be the impact if we tweaked the pricing like this? How would be the impact if we did our resourcing like that? What would be the impact if we shifted our supply network to be more centric on a geography close to us? What happens if the Suez Canal runs into trouble and we can't ship goods through there, or it costs us millions more to have to go around the southern tip of Africa? Those kinds of questions are what any operational manager, often outside of finance, is dealing with, that ERP can help them address. But today they're often, doing a lot of clicking around, trying to dig for information, combining information manually. In the future, you could see a lot of that with generative AI, either by speaking to it or doing prompts where you could have it iterate on solutions and recommendations based on a wealth of data that no human could really totally, get immersed in today. And so that's going to be one of the big things. I will say there's also a very interesting use case of AI that's developing more for the IT side of ERP. Historically, companies have spent tens of millions, even hundreds of millions, customizing these ERP systems. They're big, they're hefty, they operate the entire business. And one of the cases we're seeing now is the idea of code generation. So if you look at systems like SAP, the level of proprietary coding that's required is very high. They use a language called ABAP that hasn't changed in decades. It will still be around even with their next wave of ERP that they call S/4HANA. So if you could use code generation AI to really simplify that and elevate the skills of all your developers, that can have a meaningful impact. I mean, we have clients that they staff 200 plus offshore resources from a third-party services firm just to manage the code of SAP. So think how transformational that could really be.
So I want to tease apart a few things there because it's kind of fascinating. On the one hand, the early use cases seem pretty, banal. I'd almost say that, which is, I'm going to help a financial analyst create a better narrative, faster charts, close the books much more quickly. So it really is that typical use case, which is I just want to improve your day-to-day productivity as much as possible, which is valuable. I'm not saying it's not valuable, but it's just helping existing processes just go faster. And there still is some danger there too, because like you said, the financial narrative that you put together around your performance can have a huge impact on shareholders. It's highly regulated, et cetera. But then you talked about something really, really interesting, which is, okay, the day-to-day stuff, that's fantastic. But now actually it can help you see patterns and discover insights that you were completely unaware of. Or in the case where the business constantly is coming to a financial analyst wanting to understand the implications, wanting better capacity models, wanting to understand better resource models. Now you're asking it for insights that normally would take a financial analyst maybe weeks to put together and would have to do it quote unquote, like offline. They're downloading data to Excel probably and doing all this analysis themselves. So that's where you're getting more insight and more potentially predictive if you're asking the right questions.
Exactly. And right now, they're just not able to really consume the level of information that we have and all the external information. You always hear companies talking about, well, what if we knew about these geopolitical disruptions to our supply chain? Or what if we knew about weather patterns that were going to be affecting things? Or, any of these day-to-day changes that are not in our control, and then combine that with the things that are in our control. What places we decide to put a new warehouse, where we decide our trucks are going to be located if we're a company who manages that for ourselves, how we're going to staff projects if we're more of a services firm. And so the way that AI would be able to transform that is pretty much limitless in the sense that it will just be able to suck in more and more data, learn and adapt over time, and really do that to your own proprietary needs. If you're a services firm, let's say you're an architecture firm and you're concerned with, designing buildings, your needs are going to be very different than, let's say, a hospital system who needs to figure out the optimal shift patterns for doctors and nurses and, how you get the right locations. If you're like many hospital networks have multiple locations where patients could come in for surgeries, all of that just has so much room for optimization. And we're barely tapping into any of that today. In fact, you mentioned Excel. That area is still an area that even the largest of the large companies often are using Excel. In financial planning and analysis, it's common to see Excel, which is pretty shocking when you think of how many billions of dollars large enterprises spend on technology to run the business, that area is still fairly archaic.
Right. So it's interesting then, if we were to get into some of the technical architecture of how this will come to be, what I'm hearing actually with all those different use cases that you talked about is it's going to be very unique to the enterprise. It's going to require a lot of data. So what I'm hearing actually more is specialized LLMs as opposed to large LLMs. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Totally. And you're seeing it already. For example, Sage, they're a, large software vendor. They sell more towards small and mid-sized businesses. They already have started down this path of an LLM that is very accounting and finance centric. So I think one pattern that we'll see is that the vendors, leading vendors, Workday, SAP, Oracle, Sage, they will work on specialized LLMs because they are working in, especially as you talk about a core use case like finance and accounting, those are highly regulated and they're very specific the way that they operate. And that's one area where we'll see specialized LLMs. I'd say the other place, though, is really when you talk about your own company and how you're going to invest. Most people will not want to use just generic LLMs or even specialized LLMs from a vendor without applying their own proprietary elements to it. So much of the rich value is so specific to your own company. And so being able to even take it more specialized than say a finance and accounting oriented LLM from your ERP vendor and into something that is very specific to you is what will really unlock some of your unique differentiations. I mean, companies, first of all, they just cannot turn on a dime. So if the pattern is to ship your, electronics that you manufacture from China and see if you could do that from Mexico, you can't just do these things in a vacuum, right? They are totally grounded in where you have plants, where you have resources, where you have business relationships. And so that's where the power of not only a specialized LLM, but your proprietary data will come into play.
So your proprietary data, a specialized LLM, and what I'm hearing is like you also have the opportunity to specialize it, right? You're just not relying on the vendor themselves. So that almost becomes another form of competitive advantage then, which is it's my business itself, but now it's my highly valuable data, my own unique approach to training a highly specialized LLM that can create something that's completely inimitable by anybody else.
Totally. And every business has a starting point that's unique. Everybody has a footprint. Everybody has resources, both human and physical resources. And so to just do decision making without that would be a mistake.
So let's go back to the code development. And I, like many people, also started off my career doing ERP implementations, and I still can't believe we're coding in AVAP. I actually used to cleanse data outside of SAP in another database, like using Visual Basic, and then load it up again. So it seems like, dating myself here, like in 30 plus years, like nothing's actually changed all that much. We're still kind of either customizing the system or cleaning and ensuring quality of data the same exact way that we were 20 to 30 years ago.
There's a lot of what's old is new in software and in ERP. I think one thing that's really different about ERP now is that as you look at the shift to the cloud, everybody's on the same version. And what that has unlocked is the ability for one customer to share code with another and have that useful. So before AI, you saw this already with companies like NetSuite, late 90s, early entrant into the cloud, fully versionless. NetSuite for more than 10 years has had the ability where one company could put their code up on Reddit, and another company could take that code and inject it into their instance of NetSuite, and it would work. And this truly was happening. This has been happening, and a lot of it has been happening on Reddit. So what's different now, and when you look at AI doing code generation, there's a lot of code that is out there that works. It doesn't only work for this company because they're sitting in this configuration and they've done their code in such and such a way. It works for everyone. And so that NetSuite example is a very real one, and it's a very cutting edge one, that there's NetSuite code all over Reddit. I mean, anybody can go to Reddit and see all this discussion, and anybody can use it. So it's a lot of training data. And so that's one of the areas where you're going to see code generation is the code is available on the public internet now. Now, whether we think that should or shouldn't be, it is. And it can easily learn from that and then create more code. And then just the nature of the way they created their whole developer environment, you can inject that AI generated code into your environment now. So that whole paradigm of everybody being on the same version and the way that code is much more reusable, which was a missing concept in the early days of ERP. It was not truly reusable in the pre-cloud era. That's going to be a game changer. I do think there will still be, questions, especially for proprietary code in larger ERPs that isn't being put out on Reddit. Like, how do you really train and learn? In some ways, a system like NetSuite has an advantage because its community has already been doing that. You won't see that in all types of ERPs. You don't necessarily see tons of SAP code on the internet. But then again, they also aren't as far along in the cloud shift. NetSuite's got a couple decades head start on that. So that's one of the areas that I think is very different than the old ways of coding, is that idea of the reuse and the version list, which is a key theme we see.
Right. And so I think that's important too. I mean, everybody thinks that AI alone was the inflection point. It's like, no, AI has actually been built into these systems for quite a long time. Like there's a research director on my team that always joked, machine learning, he wanted to create a little piece of code that replaced machine learning with lots and lots of math everywhere the word showed up. So it's been around for a while, but it's more like all of these trends coming together at the same time. AI, then generative AI, the shift to the cloud, the versionless nature of it, the community sharing, the ecosystem aspect of it. Sort of all together, it just sounds like it's making these platforms much more flexible and composable than they have been in the past.
Exactly. I think cloud is the conduit to all of these shifts, because even if you look at the way that AI is going to be consumed, a lot of that's happening through these marketplaces. Workday, for example, who's technically had a bit of a limited marketplace, they don't talk about it much. They're now boasting about an AI marketplace. And you see these common partnerships and marketplaces where the vendors are able to make available in easy to consume ways add-ons and connectors. That couldn't have happened in a pre-cloud world. Things weren't so easy and seamless. And that also meant that IT was much more of a bottleneck. Today, it's a lot easier for anybody to go poke around on these marketplaces and download these AI add-ons, any kind of add-on, but AI add-ons included in that. So exactly, I think the cloud wave is really a conduit to all of this innovation. And it's a way that the innovation can be more easily consumed. And that's where, sure, if you don't want to modernize your system, you can use some AI. We have some clients who do that, but it won't be at the same level or the same potential as someone who has a more modern system and is using one of these cloud platforms.
Speaking of marketplaces, that brings up an interesting point. How much of this functionality is going to be built into the system itself? And then how much is going to be charged for? So everything we're talking about is great, like all these use cases and how it's going to be transformative. What is the price tag? Assuming you go through all the modernization, right? We're a modern ERP system, we're in the cloud, we've got a minimal amount of tech debt.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. AI will be coming from different sources. I think that's clear. There are lots of AI innovations that are part of any modern ERP. If you use Workday, if you use SAP S/4HANA, especially if you're on the cloud edition, if you use Oracle, Fusion, Cloud, you get AI. They include that in releases, but that doesn't mean all or unlimited AI. So they will have other AI that you can buy. Pricing is still just emerging, but we're starting to see that's consumption based. It's sort of a pay by the drink or pay by the complexity or the volume. And then you'll likely also augment that with other types of LLMs, which might have prices. Other types of AI tooling, which could come from the marketplace. They could come from a services firm like an Accenture or a Deloitte. And so I think what we're going to see is, first of all, AI will be coming from lots of sources. And part of the secret sauce of doing it well is going to be to figure out that right mix of sources for you. A lot and the more commodity areas can and will and should come from the ERP vendor. We don't need everybody and their brother investing in like invoice matching. It's not specialized enough. It's not differentiating enough of all the things you can invest in. But there will be other areas where these add-ons will be truly unique. It will be something that unlocks real value for your business. And that's where I think people will use a mix of things coming from their services providers, things coming from specialist AI vendors. And some of that will be facilitated by the core software vendors. You're seeing already partnerships with Anthropic and Cohere and other AI vendors, big and small. Those are a couple of big examples. With core ERP vendors. They're investors in them. They have partnerships there. But there's also, of course, just a long tail of innovative smaller vendors that might come into play too. So I think that in terms of the way that all looks from a pricing standpoint, you're going to have a very complex world because you're going to have pricing from your core ERP vendor, which is very likely to evolve to have AI-specific pricing on top of the per user per month cloud baseline price you pay. And then you're likely going to have a mix of other vendors who could each have their own pricing schemes. And there can be interdependencies. I mean, one of the reality is enterprise software vendors exist to make money. They're not the not-for-profit world, and they often have limitations and charges for data coming in and out. And so that's going to impact the way things cost. You know, if you're using a lot of stuff from third parties sucking in and out data, that can have a cost above and beyond the cost of the solutions themselves. So I do think that's going to be an emerging area of complexity, and certainly one we're already seeing some of our clients think about.
Right. For the longest time, ERP systems, because as you mentioned, like they're running the core of your business, right? So a lot of why they charge such a premium and why we only have a handful of them is that we relied on them for their domain knowledge and their domain expertise in financial management and accounting and supply chain procurement, you name it. Is there any room for a startup now, especially if they, that domain knowledge is not exclusive to the large vendors anymore? Like you could argue that with generative AI at your fingertips, that you could incorporate that into software today very easily. Like, is there room for new startups to potentially challenge some of the behemoths in the space, or actually the opposite, which is because of the fact that it is going to be this complex like marketplace where you can mix and match tools and you're going to need services. And to some extent, like you mentioned, that the sky's the limit on what you could actually create that could be completely unique to your business. Does that actually entrench the current behemoths even more?
I think it's a bit of a mix. I think there's always room for startups in any technology market, but I do think that the deep data and proven process knowledge goes a very long way in a market like ERP, where certainty matters. If you look at the complexity of, let's say, invoice regulation around the world, finance and accounting regulation around the world, which is not one size fits all, and some of the other needs that are common, there is value in these larger, established, trusted players who are doing that today with the world's largest companies. Nearly all companies use a packaged ERP today, and that's going to be very, very hard to unseat. But I do think we'll see disruption, in certain areas. around the fringes. I think we're going to see changing roles of those players versus the hyperscalers that they're partnered with today, the AWSs and Azures of the world that many of them build on. And I do think we'll see, innovation coming from different directions. But, the reality is SAP has been a leader in this space longer than I've been alive. And they're not going to be easy to unseat. And even if you look at a more recent example of a challenger in the ERP space, you could point to Workday. Workday's been around, getting close to 20 years now. Yeah, they have had some penetration. They have about 2,000 ERP customers, if you really count core finance. And they have more than 10,000 total customers. It's been a very slow process, and it's been hard to do globally. They've had a lot of success in some markets by industry and some markets by geography. So, I'd say disruption can always be there. Startups can always be there. But to unseat the global complex ERP vendors is going to be a tall task. And they do have the advantage of that data. So in terms of the data mining, they're already sitting on a wealth of customer data specific to those processes that they're already using for training in certain ways. And that's going to be very hard to compete against in a lot of ways.
So if we had to give some key advice to both business and IT leaders around ERP, because things are changing, how could they take advantage of some of these new capabilities? This merging of generative AI with cloud, with more composable systems and flexibility. Like, where would they start?
I think for a lot of people, just getting educated is important. There's a lot of courses out there that can help you learn what AI is and how it might benefit your business. Talking with peers, for example, I was at a Sage user conference earlier this year where they had a room of 50 people grouped into tables just talking about how they use AI. Looking at what your vendors are doing. If you look at vendors like Workday, Oracle, SAP, there's lots of opportunities where they'll showcase to you these, dozens and dozens of AI use cases that they already have available. Those are all great ways to kind of, dip your toe in, learn what's going on, see what's out there, keep an open mind. I'd say beyond that, though, there's some hygiene or fundamentals that people need to invest in. So guardrails and governance and policy. We did a session on this at last year's T&I forum with Ala Valente, talking about why it's important to have, your policies in place now, because things are really starting to take off. And you've seen public risks like the Samsung example that famously went wrong in terms of how AI and generative AI can be used safely and smartly. And then data quality. We all know that if you're going to be learning off of wrong data, that's a problem. So in ERP, it's interesting. The finance data is very likely to be right. Data about numbers. But as you go outside that, less so. I mean, we still see, if you're talking about collections and invoicing, you might have duplicate accounts, or you might have confused hierarchies of how things fit. Or if somebody had to put in manual notes, those are always at risk of not being totally accurate. So, keeping in mind data quality is more important than ever if we're going to move into this fast-paced world of AI. And then the other thing I would say is really start to think about cost and value. If you think about Watson, when Watson was really popular and it was going to cure cancer and all these great things that it was doing, the cost was a real inhibitor. Okay, the technology was there, it was powerful, but it was not able to be done cost effectively. And Watson X now is revitalized and now taking a new form. But I think that fundamental issue, we're dealing with very complex amounts of data, complex types of computing. The costs are really there. So if you're going to just, try to do something that could easily be done in a more simple, cheaper way, AI might not be the answer. So I think companies need to start thinking about that now. And as they're learning and evolving, make sure they're doing it in smart ways, because it's not like AI at any cost is what's going to matter for the business. It has to be smartly applied.
And actually, speaking of Tech and Innovation Forum, you'll be there once again this September.
Yes, definitely. We're going to talk about the future of enterprise software. We've got some tracks about AI and its role in enterprise software. And then I'll definitely be around for one-on-ones if anybody wants to get deeper on ERP and generative AI and do a bit of a pulse check or share what they're up to.
All right. Well, fantastic, Liz. I will be there as well. I'm looking forward to being there with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
If you like what you heard today, be sure to check out the agenda for our upcoming technology and innovation summits in Austin, London, and Sydney. Learn more at for.com/tech events. That's forr.com/tech events. Thanks for listening.